As I said at the beginning of the program, in Malaysia, prime ministers are coming and going with an almost Australian rapidity. That high job, that high office is now looking much more like a revolving door. And Malaysia has just sworn in its third prime minister in 3 years. Now, the political scene that looked promising in 2018, Mahathir Mohamad regained power on the back of a multiracial political coalition. And you'll recall he even promised to hand the leadership to our old friend Anwar Ibrahim. But then he reneged and things fell apart. Last week, another political coalition broke down. Now, the new Prime Minister has been tasked with rebooting the local economy, which has suffered through the pandemic, and things are so bad that some who were once secure or felt themselves a secure part of the middle class are now erecting white flags outside their homes to call for help. For more, we're joined by James Chin. James is Professor of Asian Studies at the University of Tasmania and the inaugural chair of the university's Asia Institute. James, welcome to our little program.
Good evening.
Would you be kind enough to introduce us to the new Prime Minister?
Sure. So the new Prime Minister name is Ismail Sabri. He's largely unknown in the political system. He was first appointed a minister more than 10 years ago in 2008, but he has kept a fairly low profile, holding a series of ministerial jobs that were not very important. And the reason why he became the prime minister is essentially he's the right person at the right place at the right time. So basically what happened was, as you mentioned, there's been a series of regime change in Malaysia. The last time the government change was back in February last year. And in that government, he came back as a minister. And in July, he was promoted to deputy prime minister. So when this government changed again, he became suddenly the front runner and he became the prime minister.
James, do you expect to see something new from this government? Would it be different?
Basically, the answer is no. I don't expect to see anything new. In fact, I see a time tunnel going back. So basically, this is a government that's very similar to the old Barisan National government. So in a way, we're slowly moving back to what Malaysia was like pre-2018, before the first regime change. So basically, this new prime minister, he spent his entire political career in UMNO, the long-serving ruling party. This is the only political method he knows. So it's very likely that the sort of things that we'll see will be very similar to what UMNO was like in Malaysia pre-2018.
I've heard you argue that without a common enemy, like the Chinese, they tend to bicker among themselves.
Yes, that's absolutely right. I think one of the things that, one of the great myths about Malaysian politics was that if the Malays are completely in charge, there will be political stability. They will treat the minorities better because they're not under threat. So all that has gone out the window after regime change last year. So last year was the very first time since independence that you had an all Malay-centric government. So last year, the three parties that formed the government were all Malay Muslim-based parties. Non-Malays were actually not allowed to join any of those parties. So essentially, all the Malays became the top-tier leaders in the Malaysian political system, and yet because they control all the levels of power, they couldn't agree among themselves, who was the big boss, and that led to divisions within the coalition, and we are seeing a new government today.
James, is it a multi-level government? Is there a reps and a senate in effect?
Yes, Malaysia has two houses of parliament, the upper house, the Senate, and the lower house. The difference is that the upper house consists of senators who are all appointed basically by the State Assembly and the King. So there's no elections for the upper house. But the lower house, there's 222 seats and everyone is elected on a single member constituency under the first past the post system.
Talking to James Chin, Professor of Asian Studies and Director of the Asia Institute at the University of Tasmania, we know the mysterious process by which the cardinals choose a new pope, gather in the Sistine, and out comes the puff of white smoke. What's the process used to pick a prime minister?
I think the process of selecting a prime minister is very similar to the way the prime minister is selected in Canberra. It's basically all about horse trading and who has the largest number. That's essentially it. It's that simple.
Isn't the king involved?
No, the king actually comes in to oversees the process. And the reason why the king had to come in to oversees the process is under the Malaysian constitution, you're not really a king until you're officially sworn in by the king. So in this case, it was clear that because of the breakdown in relationships among all the major parties in government, and also the opposition saw that, this was an opportunity to try to put forward the candidates, the king had to come in to make sure that all the numbers were correct. So
I misunderstood that. I thought the king had effectively picked him, held a conference with the 9 sultans, and then made the choice.
Yes, well, the way it works is that the king asked every member of parliament to submit a statutory declaration about who they think the prime minister should be. So once he collected all the numbers, he held a meeting with the fellow sultans to discuss who was the leading candidate and whether that candidate was acceptable. Only after that, the prime minister is appointed. So in a way, yes, the king is involved in the process. He does pick the prime minister, but at the end of the day, it was actually the MPs who submitted the statutory declarations, and that was the basis for the discussion leading towards the selection of the prime minister.
Knowing you were coming on tonight, my memory went back to a long conversation I had with Anwar Ibrahim, who during his first jail term for sodomy was only allowed access to a couple of books, the Quran, obviously, and the works of Shakespeare. And to my astonishment, James, Anwar became a very significant Shakespearean scholar. It's hard not to like a bloke like that, and I had hoped that the eternal bridesmaid of Malaysian politics might have got the nod this time. Was it ever a possibility?
Yes, in fact, when the government fell apart, if you look at the sort of numbers that were circulating in Malaysia, Anwar had probably a solid number around 105. And on the other side, the governing side, they really had a number around 99 to 100. So Anwar had a lead initially, but the problem was that he could not secure additional support. You have to remember that Anwar in the Malay community is seen as somebody who is too close to the Chinese, the non-Malays, and also he's seen as too liberal. So that's the reason why the bulk of the rural Malays rejected him.
Let's step back and look at exactly how this political turbulence came about, because for years Malaysia was thought of as a very stable country.
Yes. So what we're seeing now is essentially the whole region is sort of stepping backwards. So if you remember 4 or 5 years ago, many people were talking about democratization in Southeast Asia. A lot of those countries were slowly turning around the corner. The most prominent example, of course, was Indonesia. Then Malaysia, the regime change. But today, if you look at Southeast Asia in 2021, you see that there's a regression of basically democracy throughout the region. The Philippines has a president who's stepping down, who's a bit, how should I put it, not normal. He went into the presidential election saying that he'll shoot all the drug dealers, and that's exactly what he did. You look at the military coup in Burma, you look at the instability in Thailand caused by the active participation of the king in the political process. So basically, I think if you look around the region, my argument is that there's no bright spots for democracy anymore. Even Indonesia, if you were to look carefully, right, Jokowi has really not tried to, how should I put it? He has not really tried to promote democracy ever since he came in.
Let's look at the role, the continuing influence of the former and very problematic Prime Minister Najib. He's been found guilty of corruption, 6 more trials pending, but I understand he still casts a significant shadow.
Yes, the really interesting thing about the most powerful Malay party in Malaysia, UMNO, is that they really lack talent at the very top. So although Najib has been found guilty of corruption, He is still widely seen as a thought leader, the person with all the ideas in UMNO. He's still very, very popular. If you look at the social media handle among all the political leaders in Malaysia, including the Prime Minister's account, Najib account is probably the largest. His following on social media is probably 10 times that of the Malaysian Prime Minister.
It's a bit like the Trump situation. No matter how much trouble, no matter how many allegations, now how many demonstrated shortcomings, Trump still has a vast following, so does Najib.
Yes, but the difference is that Trump is actually crazy. Najib is not.
Okay. How bad is the pandemic in Malaysia?
I think the pandemic is reaching the peak now. So if you look at the current projections, we'll probably suffer a very serious in terms of deaths and numbers probably for one more month in September. And October and November, you will see a significant decrease. So now the important thing is to get the vaccination back on track. Basically, 50% of the population is fully vaccinated now. In other words, 2 doses of the vaccine. And Malaysia should be fully vaccinated by November this year.
Now, Indonesia spent 2020 resisting the calls for a lockdown because of the precarious economic system in these developing countries. How has Malaysia's economy fared?
The Malaysian economy has also suffered significant regression. So basically, most people will tell you that, because of the lockdown the last 2 years, last year and this year, the economy has contracted by between 5 to 10%. The problem is not really the economy contracting in most parts of Southeast Asia. It's the fact that there's no welfare system and people have very, very little savings. So if they lose their jobs, basically they lose access to food.
But I know you've also made the point that money was given, but to the elite, to factory owners, to manufacturing tycoons, when it would have been better directed to small to medium business owners.
Yes, that's correct. So if you look at the budget that was passed last year, most of the money went to the big boys in town, the big manufacturing sector, the big companies. Very little money actually went to the middle layer of the economy. But it is my understanding that this new budget, which will be passed in October, more money will be given to the smaller businesses and probably some sort of subsidy to the ordinary people.
James Chin, is there any possibility that the money was not given to the small to medium because they're ethnic Chinese?
I think that was part of the calculation last year. We have a very serious ethnic problem in Malaysia, ethnic tensions. And every time the government design a policy, they tend to look at it from the racial angle first before anything else.
Okay, tell me now about the white flag social movement.
Right. This is quite unique in Southeast Asia. So a couple of months ago, because a lot of people have lost their jobs, they didn't have any money to buy their food. What was really shocking to me was that when the NGO started this campaign called the White Flags Campaign, so basically the campaign was like this. The issue of faith in Southeast Asia is very important. So people do not want to be seen going to a food play center to collect food. So the idea was that if you fly a white flag outside your house, people will come around and leave some food for you outside your door. And you collect it at night, so nobody sees you and nobody sees whoever left the food for you. But what was really shocking for me and for a lot of other people was that a lot of the white flags began appearing in high-end middle-class neighborhoods. So this tells me that something is really happening to the middle class in Malaysia, in that the pandemic and the shutdown economy is really affecting them. The way to understand it is that normally, under normal circumstances, the Malaysian economy can be divided into 3 segments. You have the top 20%, the middle 40%, and the bottom 40%. So if you speak to people in Malaysia now, there's sort of a general agreement that the bottom 40% is now 60%. The middle class have gone down from 40% to 20%, while the top 20% is basically intact.
A very short question, or rather I require a short answer. How does Malaysia manage China, and are there any lessons to be learnt there for us in Australia?
Right, that's a really, really important question. So the way to understand how Southeast Asia looks at China is to understand that the political elites of Southeast Asia, including Malaysia, don't really see China as a threat. You have to remember, before Western colonization reached Southeast Asia, they've always lived under the Chinese shadow. So for them, it's really going back to pre-15th century. China is now a rising power again. You can feel the Chinese shadow in Southeast Asia. So a lot of them will take the attitude that we have lived under the Chinese shadow before, we will just have to live with them again. The only difference this time is that China is more aggressive, especially under this President Xi Jinping. And of course, China wants to intervene more. So for Southeast Asia, it's very similar to other parts of the world. The signature program of Xi Jinping, the BRI, Belt and Road Initiative, they're pushing very hard for the Southeast Asian section to be built within the next 10 years.
Thank you, James Chin. James is Professor of Asian Studies at the University of Tasmania.